Good morning, Clear Creek. I mean, it is a great morning to be here. I don't think I'd rather be anywhere else than just right here. I want to remind you, next week is a very special week here at Clear Creek. It is Connection Sunday. We're going to talk about connection. Our small groups are really going to be making a push to find some folks, some of you maybe who aren't in a group yet, and we want to invite you into those groups and just kind of ramp up, and some of our groups will just be starting. So we're really excited about this. We believe that small groups is just the heart and soul of what we do at this church, and we hope that if you're not in one, that your first invite, you'll go see what it's all about. We're continuing our study on Ruth. This is the last of the series. So far, we've talked about love. It's a wonderful love story. The first lesson was it was about the love that Naomi had for her daughters-in-laws and Ruth. We know that it's called safety not guaranteed. She goes to a foreign land. She loses her husband, loses her son, and she's in danger. But there's a love story between Naomi and Ruth. And then last week, we talked about the lost art of faithfulness, how Ruth had made this wonderful promise to Naomi, and that she had kept that promise with a great deal of faithfulness because Ruth also loved Naomi. But this week, we're going to get into the part of the story that most people remember, this love story between Ruth and Boaz. So before we begin, let's bow together in a word of prayer. Father, you're an awesome God, and we thank you for this morning. We thank you for all the blessings that we have. Thank you for the people who are here. They could have been anywhere they wanted to be today. And they chose to be with your family praising you. And Father, our prayer is that as we meet together this morning, we'll come to a clearer understanding of just exactly how much you love us. Father, it is a wonderful blessing to know you love us and that you've shown your love for us through your Son, Jesus. And as we study, as we sing, as our hearts are lifted up to you, may this be a day that truly, truly enlightens us to just exactly what a wonderful God you are. We thank you for Jesus. With him, we're nothing. Without him, we can be all things. And in him we have salvation. Most importantly, in him we have hope. And it's in his name we pray. And amen. How many of you have a mother-in-law? Raise your hand. You know, a lot of people say coarse things about their mothers-in-law, and you hear all these mother-in-law jokes. To be honest with you, none of them really make sense to me. I have a wonderful mother-in-law. Please ask your mom to watch this online, please. I do. I have a wonderful mother-in-law. I love her dearly. Mothers-in-law, though, are a unique relationship because you're married to the apple of their eye. And if anybody's going to get thrown under the bus, it's going to be you. But in this particular case, Naomi, the mother-in-law of Ruth, is watching out for her. We know the story so far that they've gone to a foreign land. All the men have died. Naomi shows her love for Ruth by saying, oh, you know what, you need to go back to your home, marry someone that's a Moabite, raise your children, live a happy life, don't worry about me. Even though it would have been easier for Naomi to let Ruth come and help her out. However, Ruth turns around and says, you know, where you go, I'll go. Where you lodge, I'll lodge. Your people will be my people. Your God will be my God. She makes this amazing promise, and she lives up to it. Because not only does Naomi love Ruth, Ruth loves Naomi. And then last week, as we studied this story, we found out that as Ruth was busy keeping her promise to Naomi, she was in the field gleaning from the edges of the field, trying to find enough grain so that they could have bread to eat. She meets an amazing man, and his name is Boaz. And the interesting thing is that when we read this story at first glance, it's really difficult to understand what an incredible man Boaz really is. Because as we look in this story, He is a truly good, godly, amazing man. But at first glance, Ruth really doesn't know who he is. But she goes home, and Naomi, when she hears the name, she knows exactly who it is. And like any good mother-in-law, she's got a plan. Here's the plan. She tells him Boaz is close kin. Now, before we go any further, I need to explain what that means. There's a thing in the tradition in the Israelites called the kinsman redeemer. And the kinsman redeemer was a tradition, it wasn't a law. And what would happen was, if someone was a widow and she had no heir, instead of having to lose her property, someone who was a close kinsman could come in and purchase that property, keeping it out of having to be sold, even though in this case Naomi had already sold her property and the redeemer would have to buy it back. But number one, it saved the property. But number two, they were to also come into this family and to have children with this widow so that the lineage can continue. For several reasons. One reason was because that created a bigger nation for Israel. Another thing that was interesting too is he came in and created that lineage in order to continue the purity of the Israel race, of the Jewish race. And so when Naomi hears this and she hears about Boaz, the light goes off. She says, oh, wait a minute. There's a redeemer. So here's what I want you to do. I want you to go in, because tonight what they're going to do is they're going to have a big party. They're finished threshing. They've threshed all the wheat. They've got it all separated, and they're going to eat, and they're going to eat, and they're going to eat. And then Boaz is going to get his drink on. You know what I'm talking about. They're going to drink. They're going to drink. They call it drink and be merry. You know what that means. And then, so by the time he lays down and he goes to sleep, I want you to go in and lay at his feet. And that's where we pick up in Ruth chapter 3, verse 9. Boaz wakes up and he sees this woman at his feet and he says to her, who are you? And she answered, I am Ruth, your maid. Now wait just a minute, you're thinking, well, he's already met Ruth. Yeah, but it's the middle of the night and he's in the barn. He can't see her. Who are you? I'm Ruth, your maid. So spread your covering over your maid, for you are a close relative. Put your finger there, we're going to keep going. And then he said, may you be blessed of the Lord, my daughter. You have shown your last kindness to be better than the first by not going after young men, whether poor or rich. And then he makes a vow to her. He says, now, my daughter, do not fear. I will do for you whatever you ask. For all of my people in the city know that you are a woman of excellence. I love what's going on here, because what she does is this. She walks in the middle of the night. He's already asleep. She lays down. When he wakes up, he wants to know who she is. And her first statement is, I am Ruth, your maid. Why don't you place your covering on me? That's kind of a weird request, isn't it? If it were Beyonce, she would be saying, if you like it, then you better put a ring on it. Because that's what that meant. If you wanted to, if you were in a situation like this, which was considered kind of a sketchy situation, the way to rectify that situation was to marry this woman. And the way you did that is like today we put an engagement ring on a woman's finger. At that time they would place his cloak, his garment over her. And so it's kind of brazen for Ruth to go in there and she was going to say, you know what, here's how we can deal with this, just marry me. Now, Boaz could have had a lot of different reactions. His first reaction was gratefulness. Thank you so much for not going after a younger, richer man. It leads us to believe that Boaz is probably significantly older than Ruth. And then he says, I'll do what you need to do. But then there's a twist, and that's where we get to in verse 12. It says, now it's true that I'm a close relative. However, there is a relative closer than I. Now the kinsman redeemer, the closest relative, got first shot at the property. We continue, remain this night, and when morning comes, if he will redeem you, good, let him redeem you. But if he does not wish to redeem you, then I will redeem you, as the Lord lives. So lie down until morning. You're talking about hope. Naomi knew what was going to happen. She knew what kind of man Boaz was. And she had gone from feeling like, I'm marrow, I'm bitter, God has dealt bitterly with me, to knowing somebody is going to help. This whole rest of the story is about one word: hope. We're going to find out 3 things about hope, and these 3 things are eternal. You can write them in stone. They never change. And the first teaching point is this, that hope can always exist. No matter what situation you're in, no matter how much you're hurting, hope can always exist. As we read this story and we really get up to the end of chapter 2 and we're in chapter 3 seeing what's going on, we're realizing that there is a shift happening in the demeanor of Naomi and the demeanor of Ruth. And here's why. At the end of chapter 1 and into chapter 2, Naomi and Ruth were experiencing what we would call suffering. Now, suffering and pain are different. A lot of times we think pain and suffering are the same thing, but they're really not. Suffering and pain are very different because pain is something that is inevitable. Everyone in this room, everyone you know, is going to experience pain. But suffering is what happens when you experience pain without hope. Suffering is where you think there's never going to be light at the end of the tunnel. This situation that I really think stinks is never, ever going to change. And Naomi and Ruth, until Boaz comes along, they're suffering. But when Boaz shows up, there's hope. And you have to see the hope here because with Boaz, what's happening is that he's saying, if this guy doesn't redeem you, I will redeem you. So what you need to do, go back to Naomi and let her know her suffering's over. How cool is that? Isn't that the message of Christ too? That no matter where you are, no matter what you've done, no matter what's happened in your life, wherever your circumstance is, go back and tell your people that the suffering's over. We're going to be redeemed. Hope can always, always exist. And so Boaz, being a righteous man, wanting to do the right thing, in chapter 4, the first 4 verses, we find out this about Boaz. It says, Now Boaz went up to the gate and sat down there, and behold, the close relative of whom Boaz spoke was passing by. So he said, Turn aside, friend, and sit down here. And he turned aside and sat down. He took 10 men of the elders, he wanted witnesses, by the way, of the city and said, Sit down here. So they sat down. And then he said to the closest relative, Naomi has come back from the land of Moab to sell and has to sell a piece of land which belonged to our brother Elimelech. So I thought to inform you, saying, Buy it before those who are sitting here. By the way, if there was no one to claim it, anyone could buy the land. And before the elders of the people, if you will not if you will redeem it, redeem it. But if not, tell me that I may know, for there is no one but you to redeem it, and I am after you. And then the man, the close relative, that's who this is, says, I will redeem it. Okay, he's sitting here. What's happening is he's saying, there's hope. The Redeemer's here. Someone's going to redeem it. So the closest kin decides that he's going to redeem it. But there's something else going on. You see, if Boaz were playing poker, he would have a card up his sleeve right now. Because he knows this guy. And he's about to do the second part of hope. But hope always exists. This man looks at this property and says, hey, I'll buy it. I'll bring Naomi hope. That's a good thing. But then what Boaz knows is that hope, real hope, always has a cost. Real hope's costly. You see, up until this point, what this man knows is that there's a widow named Naomi who's very old, and she has some property. And so Boaz drops a little knowledge on him. We keep reading. Verses 5 and 6, and then we're going to skip down to 9 and 10. It says, Then Boaz said, On the day you buy the field from the hand of Naomi, you must also acquire Ruth the Moabitess. The closest relative, the widow of the deceased, in order to raise up the name of the deceased in his inheritance. Remember, that's part of what the kinsman redeemer did. The closest relative said, I cannot redeem it for myself because I would jeopardize my own inheritance. Redeem it for yourself. You may have my right of redemption, for I cannot redeem it. Now, here's what's going on. This is really cool. This first guy who says, I'll take it, Here's what he thought was happening. He thought he was getting a really old lady that he wasn't going to have children with. He was going to buy her property, and he would take care of her until she died. When she died, all that property would come to him, and he would increase his own holdings. This was a good deal, low cost, low risk. But when you throw Ruth in there, you've got a totally different stew. Because what's happening is he's saying, well, wait a minute now. I didn't know about this Ruth, and I didn't know I was going to have children by her. And if I do that, maybe it'll come into jeopardy, because the law, basically, of the kinsman redeemer was that he would have children with this woman. Her heirs would eventually get the land back. Not only that, they may get some of his property as well, because they're considered part of his lineage. And so when he sees this, he's saying, well, wait a minute, you just shot the cost through the roof. I can't afford to pay that. I can't afford to jeopardize my own holdings by helping Naomi and this Ruth out. And so we go into verses 9 and 10. It says, you're witnesses today that I have bought from the hand of Naomi all that belonged to Elimelech and all that belonged to Chilion and Mahlon. Moreover, I have acquired Ruth the Moabitess, the widow of Mahlon, to be my wife, in order to raise up the name of the deceased on his inheritance, so that the name of the deceased will not be cut off from the brothers or from the court of this birthplace. And you are my witnesses today. He sits there and says, everybody look, he didn't want it, I do. Now it's kind of interesting here when you start talking about the cost, though, because Boaz was a very wealthy man. He understood business, and he realized that what he was doing was risky and it was high cost. And so we understand why the other kinsmen didn't want to claim Naomi and Ruth and this measly parcel of land, because it really wasn't a good deal for him. So why would it be a good deal for Boaz? Why on earth would a man with the holdings of a Boaz, who was famous in all of Israel, want to take hold of this piece of property? It's because he was in love. See, Boaz loved Ruth. He loved her at first sight. And you see, for him, there was no price too high to gain this woman that he loved. And do you know that that's how Jesus feels about us? This morning, Gary read from 1 Peter chapter 1. I'm going to go just a few verses over. 1 Peter 1, 18 and 19. It tells us this. It says, knowing that you were not redeemed with perishable things like silver or gold from your feudal way of life inherited from your forefathers, but look at this, but with precious blood, as of a lamb unblemished, spotless, the blood of Christ. You know, the idea of redeeming people like us with the sins that we have and the filth that is on us because of the times that we have said yes to Satan and no to God, the redemption, the cost for that was incredibly high. It was more, if you don't catch anything else I say, don't forget this. The cost for us was more than we are worth. And I know that's hard to swallow, but it's the truth. We weren't redeemed by anything temporal. We were redeemed by the supernatural, and this high cost was paid. Jesus was beaten to a pulp, stripped naked, hung on a cross, thrown in a tomb, raised the third day, and he did that because he loves us so much that he'd rather die than live without us. The cost was high, and it didn't matter. He was willing to pay it, but it's bigger than that. Because Boaz teaches us and shows us more about Jesus here, because it's not just the high cost and the willingness to pay that high cost, but Paul writes this in Ephesians chapter 1. Verse 7 and the first part of verse 8, he says, in him we have redemption through his blood, the forgiveness of our trespasses. Isn't it nice to know we're forgiven? And then he goes on to say, according to the riches of his grace, which he lavished upon us. Has anybody ever lavished anything on you? Have you ever been lavished? Some of you might say we've been lavished with money. That's probably one of the least important things to me. How about lavished with praise? Lavished with kindness? Lavished with love? Lavished with grace? The idea that you think, that's enough. That's all I need. Thank you for that kindness. That's all the kindness I need. And the person said, no. Oh, that's nothing. I want to be even more kind to you. Oh no. That's all. No, I've got more love for you. Imagine that. That's how Jesus feels about us. That's how Boaz felt about Ruth. You see, it was a bad deal financially for Boaz, but from his heart, he couldn't give enough. And for the rest of his life, he would pour his love on this woman and their children. And that's how God feels about us. It was costly, but I think our God would tell us that it was worth it. And the last thing is, hope in the right place brings freedom. You know, I think the greatest sin, one of the greatest sins in my life and probably in yours as well, and I see it in the church, the greatest sin that we have is that we try to be our own redeemer. We want to be self-sufficient. We want to say, I can handle this. We want to think that salvation is dependent on our actions. And the problem is that that's not where hope lies. Hope comes when you're helpless. Hope comes when you're in suffering and not knowing what's going to happen next. And so often we want to be our own saviors when the truth is we can't do that. We need a Savior. And the pinnacle of the story occurs. We go into chapter 4, verse 13. We're going to read through verse 17. It says, so Boaz took Ruth and she became his wife. And he went into her and the Lord enabled her to conceive. And she gave birth to a son. Then the women said to Naomi, not Ruth, I find this weird, blessed is the Lord who has not left you without a redeemer. And may his name become famous in Israel. May he also be to you a restorer of life and a sustainer of your old age. For your daughter-in-law, who loves you and is better to you than 7 sons, has given birth to him. Then Naomi took the child, laid him on her lap, became his nurse, and the neighbor woman gave him a name, saying, a son has been born to Naomi. So they named him Obed. He is the father of Jesse and the father of David. You know, the Israelites, when they read this, I don't think they really understood the power in these words. Because when we look at this and it says that they had this child, and this child was not just a blessing to Ruth and to Boaz, but it was a blessing to Naomi, we see that these women were saying things about him that were unique. Because you go back and you look and they're saying things like, may his name become famous in all Israel, this Redeemer. See, today you have a Redeemer. Well, she had a Redeemer a long time before that. I mean, it takes 9 months to have a child, right? I don't think it was anything abnormal about the birth of Obed. But they're saying, today you have a Redeemer. So you must not be talking about Boaz. And then it goes on to say, may his name be famous in Israel. Couldn't be Boaz. His name was already famous in Israel. May he be a restorer. Well, if any restoration had happened, it had already happened, but there was more happening here. Because they were looking at this child and they were realizing that there was something special about this child. That's why it's so important in that last part of the verse where it says that they named him Obed, and he was the father of Jesse, who was the father of David, whose lineage Jesus came. You remember we talked earlier in this lesson about how the purity of the race was important to the Israelites. There was one cost here that for the first person was a high cost. Ruth was a Moabitess, and that would be an impure race. Boaz? Why was he not worried about it? Because Boaz was the son of Rahab. He wasn't purebred anyway. And basically this message is, there is one who is coming, there is one who will be born, that it doesn't matter who you are, it doesn't matter where you come from, it doesn't matter what your past entails, it doesn't matter where your future is going to go, because it's going to go with him. And he is going to be your restorer, he is going to be your redeemer. You know, we have this cross hanging here. A lot of you may not know that when they brought this cross to the building, it was smooth and shiny. And someone said that's not what the cross was like. And so if you ever come up here, I invite you to come up here sometime and look at it real closely. You'll realize they laid the cross down on the floor, and they took a hatchet and they chopped on this cross so that it would be rough. And you know, for decades, for 2,000 years, this cross has been a symbol to us of something important. It's been a symbol of Jesus and his death. But you have to understand that this cross is more than that. This cross is an intersection. It's the intersection of two beams. And it represents the intersection of God with us. It's the intersection of our humanity with his divinity. It's the intersection of our story with his story. It's the intersection of our sin with his love. And all those things placed in a pile and worked together mean this: we have hope. We have a God who loves us. We have a future. We have an eternity. We're eternal beings today. There's a story about a little boy. And this story is so old, no one really knows who initiated it, or I would tell you who wrote the story. But he was walking in front of a church, and there was an old priest standing in front of the church. The little boy had a bird cage, and in it were just some old birds he'd caught in the field. Priest says, "What do you got there?" And he says, "Oh, I just got some birds caught in the field." Well, what are you going to do with them? I don't know. Play with them a little while. Eventually they're going to die. And the old priest looks at him and says, "What do you take for the birds?" "Oh, mister, you don't want these birds. They're gray. They're not pretty. They don't sing well. They're just old birds. You can get them anywhere. Why would you want to pay me for these birds?" "That doesn't matter. What do you take for the birds?" When he names the price, the priest pays for it, and before the little boy leaves, the priest takes the cage and he opens it, and the birds fly away. You see, because our story intersects with his, because our sin intersects with his love, he sets us free. We're free people today. We're free indeed. We're told that it was for freedom that Christ set us free. But there are a lot of people in this world that still are enslaved. They're still in this cage. They're caught by sin. And they need to be set free too. Now, you may be one of them. Maybe you want to see that cage open up and live a life that is free in Christ. We want to invite you to do that. The way we think that happens is that we believe that baptism is your very first step in a journey with Jesus. So if you'd like to be baptized, we'd love to do that.